In this video, we're going to talk about Smalti. For those of you who are undertaking level 2 of the Art of Andamento curriculum, you will be aware that I am using Mexican Smalti primarily as my medium to make the samples in that course. Some of you might be very well aware of the differences between all the different types of Smalti and what they're used for. Other students may have absolutely no idea. So I'm going to break down a couple of the major differences for you today. So everything I have here on the table in front of me is Smalti in different forms. Now, what I have here is not all the types of Smalti that are available. There are plenty more than this. But what I have here is some Mexican Smalti and some Italian Smalti and even some German Smalti. Now, let's have a look at the differences between them. Now, the two main types of Smalti that we have available to us is Mexican and Italian. So some people say, well, Italian's far superior, it's much better quality, it's easier to cut, etc. Others say, no, Mexican is slightly more affordable and it's easier to cut and it's a better entry-level product. So I don't really have an opinion either way, but I do use both materials in my work all the time. The first thing I'd like to show you is the differences in the thickness of the material. So the key difference between Mexican and Italian is the thickness at which the slab of glass cools to after it has been poured from the crucible onto a slab. Both Mexican Smalti and Italian Smalti are made in a similar way, in a crucible, and then the liquid enamel glass is tipped from the crucible onto a slab. It forms a puddle of glass. In Mexican Smalti, it's referred to as a tortilla. In Italian Smalti, it's referred to as a pizza. Both of them are slabs of glass, named after bread. Sometimes the slab is poured into a mold, so it doesn't set in an organic pizza shape. But most of the time, the shape of the pizza or tortilla can be fairly organic. Now, in terms of thickness, it is pretty standard throughout all of the Mexican Smalti that we get a thickness of 6 millimeters. The Italian Smalti, on the other hand, cools to a thickness of 10 millimeters. So the pizza is thicker in the Italian, the tortilla in the Mexican is thinner. So I have some of those on the table in front of me. So this one here is a Mexican tortilla. It is from the Perdomo foundry in Mexico, and it has a back here and a front. You can see that this has been cooled into an oval shape and it's been cut in half here. So on the front of the tortilla, the color is reasonably consistent. There's a little bit of marbling and some color variation, and perhaps some bubbles have emerged. On the back of the tortilla, you can see the patterns that have formed when the glass has hit the slab, and you can also see the marks from the slab where it has been cooled. So we have a slightly different color palette on the back to the front. And notice that the thickness of the material is consistent throughout, more or less, at approximately 6 millimeters. The Italian Smalti, on the other hand, has a thickness of 10 millimeters, and you can see here the thickness of the piece that I have in my hand. We still have a front and a back. Notice again, the back is often marbled and mottled, and it has a sheen on it which can be removed with acid. However, there is definitely a difference in color between the back and the front. There are other thicknesses of Smalti available. So we've talked about the 6 millimeter and the 10 millimeter. We can obtain Smalti that is thicker as well as thinner than that, but I'm not going to talk about that today, but it does exist. What I would like to talk about next is the different cuts of Smalti that you will see and what the names of those are. Okay, so we've talked about the tortilla. When we purchase Mexican Smalti, generally though, we are purchasing what is called an A cut. So in Mexican, the A cuts are roughly this size. You can see that they're quite variable. We have roughly a 2 centimeter by 15 millimeter or 15 by 15. It really depends, but these are cut with a guillotine. So they're advertised as being hand cut, meaning there's an operator operating a guillotine that is cutting the pieces down from the slab. So A-cut Mexican look like this, and this is what we purchase regularly for our work. Now let's look at an A-cut of Italian Smalti. Okay, so an A-cut of Italian Smalti is in general 2 centimeters by 1 centimeter in its profile. The depth of the Smalti can vary, so sometimes you might get thicker pieces, sometimes you might get thinner pieces. Now I'm going to talk about why that is in a moment. However, I'm reinforcing that this is also called an A-cut. And if you buy pre-cut Italian Smalti in an A-cut, this is the type of size that you will get. The A-cuts are a first quality product, meaning they are the best of that particular batch, meaning the cuts are consistent and usually very good quality. Let's now move to what is called a B cut. So this is approximately a B cut size for Italian Smalti. It's also sometimes called a Ravenna cut, and it's approximately 5 by 5 centimeters or 2 by 2 inches roughly. It's not always exactly the same size. So this is called our A cut. This is called our B cut, and our C cut is roughly 10 by 10 centimeters. So these two here are both Italian Smalti from the Morossuti company, a beautiful eco Smalti product from northern Italy. A C cut is around this size, around 10 by 10 centimeters, and normally in a square. So these are individual pizzas that have been made to this size in a mold and are absolutely beautiful to cut and use. From the A cut, the B cut and the C cut, then we move to the actual pizza cut. So we can purchase pizza that's been cut into a larger slab. Now you would purchase something like this if you wanted to form larger pieces in your work, or you wanted to cut all your A cuts down yourself using a guillotine or a hammer and hardy. You can see this pizza here. Now this pizza is vintage German glass, and you can see that it is a full pizza and it is in an ovoid shape. You can see the irregular nature of the shape of the pizza, and you can see that its edge is rounded and slightly thinner. You will notice that all the pizzas that have been poured naturally have a rounded edge. Now the rounded edge gets cut off and discarded and sold in the next thing I'm going to show you, which is the roti, which is the offcuts. So this here is what we would call the roti. Now the roti is the offcuts generated from cutting down the full-size pizzas. So what we will see in the roti, we see the rounded edges of the larger pizzas that have been removed. And we also see other shapes, such as this, which looks like an A-cut, but in fact is really skinny, and it is too skinny to be sold as a first quality A-cut product. So it gets put in a mixture with other roti of other offcuts from the edges of the other pizza, and it gets put in a mix and sold for a reduced price. The other cut that you may come across is called pastrami, which is also an offcut, but it's an offcut that's a bigger piece. So something like this is what we would classify as pastrami. So you can see that the pieces are still very, very useful, but they're not really perfectly formed. So we have less flexibility in what we do with them. So we have our first quality A-cuts, our first quality pizza, our second quality roti and pastrami. So generally speaking, the pastrami and roti are less expensive than the A-cuts and the Ravenna cuts and the pizza, because they are perhaps oddly shaped, maybe the color's not right, maybe they've got air bubbles in them, etc. now that we have talked about some of the different formats of Smalti available, and there is many more, as I mentioned, we're going to now look at the two main products that we use, which are the A-cuts of the Mexican Smalti and the A-cuts of the Italian Smalti, and we're going to look at the difference. So let's refresh that the Mexican Smalti from the Padermo factory is poured into a tortilla that is 6 millimeters in depth. It cools to 6 millimeters on the slab. We have a front, which is consistent in color, and a back, which is variable in color. Now, you'll notice that the A-cuts of the Mexican also have this difference on the front and the back. So if we look at the A-cuts here, I can turn them all over and I can see that more or less one side of our A-cuts is similar to the front of the tortilla, and the other side of our A-cuts is similar to the back of the tortilla. So it's a darker, more mottled surface. So this is showing us that the main A-cut piece that we use, if we place this in our mosaic, we are exposing the back or the front of the tortilla. So this is why we have a wider surface area to work with, and we have more variation in the color because we can use this side or we can use this side, etc. We could, of course, put the piece on its edge and expose the inside of the Mexican A-cut. Now, the main difference between the Mexican and the Italian is with the Italian, we use the inside face as standard. So let's look at that now. So here we have some blue A-cut and a blue pizza. Now what you'll notice is if I turn my Italian pizza up on the side, it's a lovely, consistent internal colour all the way through. It's exactly the same. They have extremely good quality control on the colours. If I look at the piece of Italian Smalti here in an A-cut, it's a slightly different colour. However, we have a product that is exactly the same width as the pizza. So what it's showing us is that when we work with Italian Smalti, we are exposing the inside face, or what is often called the riven edge of the material. What I can do here is if I put my Italian pizza with the back side up, you can see it's very dark and mottled, I can find the equivalent back side on these pieces of Italian A-cut, and you'll see that it has a front and a back as well. So what I'm looking at here is the back. It may not all be from the same batch or the same color, but you get the idea. So there's the back, which is darker and more mottled. And then there is the front, which is lighter and more consistent and more in line with the color that is inside the pizza. Okay, so you can see there, it's a different side on the front. If I flip this over, you can see that that color is similar, right? Now, with this material, we don't work with it standing up like that or standing up like that. Usually, we work with it lying down like this. We work with it lying down and we cut the pieces. We generally don't use 4 pieces unless we're making a mural, okay? So we cut the 4 pieces down, but we lay them with the inside face exposed. So we're looking at the inside of the material. With Mexican, we are looking at the outside of the material. So outside, inside, major difference. Now, what happens if you want a bigger piece than this? Well, that's when you need to get yourself a B cut, a C cut, or a pizza that you can then cut a bigger piece from. You might ask, well, how do I do that? How do I cut that? We'll cover that in another video, but essentially to cut this down into larger slabs, you would be using your hammer and hardy with the help of a glass cutter for larger sections. So now that we've discussed some of the different types of Smalti available, in particular the differences between Mexican Smalti and Italian Smalti. In another video, I'm going to show you how to cut each of these with wheeled nippers.